Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of the Men's Voices Ireland podcast. Now, in this episode, we're going to be talking about family law. Now, it is quite a big subject, so we won't be getting into everything, but we'll try and get you as much as possible. So, on the podcast with me today is Men's Voices Ireland member Frank McGlynn. How are you doing, Frank?
Not too bad at all. Yourself?
So I'm good, yeah. Let's get into it. So,
Right.
over the years, you have met quite a lot of men who have gone through the family law system. What is your perception regarding fairness to both parties?
Well, my perception's very clear. It's far from fair. Not at all fair. In fact, I'd say it's extremely unfair to men. This is down to the manner in which it's structured, the legislation that governs it, the attitudes of judges and the various other practitioners. I've heard it said family law has been designed to achieve three objectives: to privilege women, persecute men, and provide another gravy train for the legal profession. And I'd have to say it's been an outstanding
It's been
success.
successful in all three.
Very successful in achieving all three. It certainly does tremendous damage to men's lives.
So, I think some people would have difficulty in understanding how the system can be so biased against men when the majority of politicians, judges, etc., are men themselves.
Yeah, it's true that the vast majority of politicians are men. Most judges, I'm not too sure what the percentage is, but most judges are men as well. Though in family law there tend to be a lot of women judges. But the problem is that while men in power actually don't have that much interest in men's issues and men's well-being, they're much more interested in women's issues and women's well-being. If you asked your average politician to talk about issues affecting men or
They wouldn't
injustice,
be able to name a lot of them.
they'd clam up, they'd say nothing. Ask them to
They
talk
might-
ask them to talk about women's issues,
Yeah,
not
they-
talk for hours.
Yeah, like they might bring up kind of the suicide.
Suicide's the obvious one that they would bring up, but again, they would deal with it from what I would call the feminist perspective. In other words, it's the nature of men. It's down to men. Or the old cliches of men not talking, you know.
Yeah.
But no, they don't really have any interest in men's issues at all. And I suppose the area where the interests of men and women come into the most acute conflict would be family law. And I would say that family law, because all the concern has been about women's issues, women's well-being, the system has been designed to, as far as possible, insulate women from the inevitable pain and suffering by inflicting most of the pain and suffering on men. That's particularly true in the family law system, and you can see that in the manner in which the family law system has evolved. There's been no consideration really given to fathers' rights or to men's rights or well-being. A prime example of the lack of concern for men's rights in the area of family law, I think, would be seen if you actually analysed the period leading up to the divorce referendum in 1995. This was a very, very contentious referendum which was widely debated. It was probably the most contentious and most widely debated referendum up to that point in the history of the state. And if you looked at the debates, both parties, both sides of the debate would have been arguing that divorce is good for society, divorce is bad for society, divorce is good for society, divorce is bad for society, divorce is good for children, divorce is bad for children, or more often, divorce is good for women. From one side, the other side would say divorce is bad for women. But in all the mountains of articles written, in all the hours and days of debates, you'll probably never find a single person.
Mention men.
It's as if men aren't even part of the family, that whole debate. The idea that divorce could be good or bad for men just didn't enter the consciousness of the people. And and it's because of that we now have a family law system dealing with divorce and separation, which is very, very detrimental to men's lives. Part of the reason, of course, this is that at the time there were no, and even yet there are very few groups advocating on behalf of men, and that is one of the great problems in this whole area. Women's groups have lots, and even then had lots of very well resourced groups, most of them paid for by the taxpayer, financed by the taxpayer, and they were advocating for men. I mean, the typical example of the National Women's Council, which gets something in the region of €1 million a year, but nothing really for men, nobody advocating for men.
Yeah, it does kind of go back to that whole thing of, well, men are in power, so they must be empowering men. But it's like,
they're not in power.
They're not.
Certain people are in power, but they don't pursue men's issues or have no interest in men's issues.
So you kind of brought it up a little bit there about how the family law system has evolved. So fair enough, it didn't.
Yeah.
The family law system didn't become kind of this biased and anti-man overnight. It obviously evolved over many, many years. So can you give a brief synopsis of how it has evolved and how it's gotten to the state it is in today?
Yeah, well, if you go back, say, 50 years or maybe 40 years ago, there was very little family law legislation on the statute books and very little court activity dealing with family issues. There was, for instance, there was a Guardianship of Infants Act 1964, and there's some piece of legislation carried over from the days of British rule. But since then, family law has now become a massive industry. I've heard that it accounts for over 30% of all civil law activity. So it really is a major part of the legal industry. I've heard a very good description of family law is that it's a multi-million euro industry that survives and thrives by exploiting and inciting hostility between parents. Now, there's naturally going to be hostility between parents, but the family law system exacerbates that hostility. And in doing so, of course, it sustains many lucrative careers. I'm not sure how many people are making loads of money out of family law, but there's a marriage breakdown and family problems, but there's an awful lot of very good careers being supported by that. And this has been something that has been evolving and increasing from the 1970s and 80s onwards. How it's become as it is, you have to look at who has shaped family law. The groups that have really shaped family law are women's groups and the legal profession. Those two groups have really driven the family law agenda. Where it started, you'll probably have to go back to 1972. In 1972, there was an organisation set up called AIM, A-I-M, AIM. AIM, the Family Law Reform Group, was the name of the organisation at that time. That organisation pushed for the enactment of lots of family law legislation, and they caused an awful lot of family law legislation to put on the statute books. Now, lots of this law was necessary and lots of it was good, but not all of it. For instance, there was a very good piece of legislation. One of the first pieces of legislation would have been the Family Home Protection Act of 1976, which prohibited one spouse, the owning spouse, which was usually the man, from endangering the home, the family home, and leaving, say, the other party homeless. That was good legislation. It protected the right of both parties, both husband and wife, to live in their home. And that was good legislation. But, and that was one good thing AIM done. Now, as I said, AIM it consisted almost all their members were, certainly all their steering group or executive committee were female, entirely female lawyers and feminist activists. So you can see why they wouldn't have too much concern with men's issues or men's rights. The big boost for the family law industry came in 1989. That was the enactment of the Judicial Separation Act of 1989. That is really what turned family law into the industry that it is today. That was put on the statute books by a gentleman called Alan Shatter, who was a politician. But as well as being a politician, he also had a legal practice which became one of the leading family law practices in the country. Mind you, Mr. Shatter did very well out of that. He was actually one of the wealthiest politicians in Dáil Éireann, and that didn't come entirely from his TD's pay or senator's pay or whatever. But since 1989, the growth in the family law industry has been phenomenal. It's created an awful lot of legal activity, and as I've said already, it's created so many careers, and it keeps on expanding. Almost every Dáil session, you'll find new bits of family law being added. That increases activity and creates more careers. So the vested interests who are there, who push the family law agenda, they're very creative. They're very good at coming up with new ideas to expand the industry.
So, can you give an example of how kind of legislation and the family law system itself disadvantages men?
Yeah, well, if you look, for instance, say at separation or divorce, in any separation or divorce, there's three main issues, three big issues, and these are the children, the family home, and finances, the income, in other words.
Yeah.
Now, the legislation is structured in such a way that it virtually guarantees that the woman will be victorious under all three headings. The pivotal piece of legislation that guarantees women victory is Section 10 of the Family Law Act 1995. Now, if you look at that act at a superficial level, it appears to be gender neutral, but in actual fact, it isn't, and certainly isn't in the way it's enforced. What the Family Law Act says, Section 10 says, is there's two things that are very important. Number one, it says that once a decree of separation has been granted, the parties can no longer live together. In other words, one of them has to get out of the home. And Section 2, another part of it says, is that the court, in making an order under this section, must ensure that secure accommodation is provided for the dependent spouse, or the spouse who is wholly or partly dependent. And in most cases, the one who is wholly or partly dependent is the female party. It doesn't mention the provider spouse. In fact, there's no regard. What happens in is nobody's business. In fact, I remember a man coming to me. He lived down the Midlands. He was originally from North Antrim. And he told me he went into the court, and when the judge made the Section 10 order evicting him from his home, he'd done no wrong, of course, but she wanted a separation, so he had to be kicked out of the house. And he said to the judge, well, what happens to me now? Where do I live? And the judge says, well, look, he says, you can live in the side of the road for all I care. You know, that sounds harsh, but in actual fact, the judge was acting in accordance with the law, with the law, the spirit of the law. So when a decision is made on the family home, with the family home goes the children, and with the home and the children, most of the income goes in the same direction. So that effectively gives women victory under all three main headings. So the man is now out of the home. He finds himself that if there's a mortgage on the house or rent has to be paid, he, as the main earner, must continue to pay the mortgage, continue to pay the rent on a house that he can't live in. He'll find that because the courts effectively split the family in two, they create one unit, which is the mother and children. They're one unit.
Yeah.
The man, the provider spouse, is a separate unit, and most of his income will go to pay for the mortgage, for maintaining the wife and maintaining the children. And depending on his earnings, from whatever's left over, he then has to accommodate himself and provide for himself. And in many cases, that's very, very little.
Especially given with the rises of the cost of living
current
at the moment.
That's impossible. I mean,
it's almost impossible to actually fund a family that's together and intact.
Absolutely.
Just imagine how bad it is for men.
It's bad, but it's not bad for women. She gets to continue living in the house. The man usually ends up in substandard accommodation, like a bedsit, or sharing a house with other men in similar circumstances, or going back to live with his parents, or live with siblings, or get a spare room in a friend's house. And of course that type of thing impacts severely on his relationship with his children. It makes it almost impossible.
Yeah, because the court kind of makes it you need to have suitable accommodation to have access with the children.
Absolutely.
But the fact that he doesn't have any way of getting a accommodation that's in any way good makes it that.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
As well.
I mean, it's a regular occurrence that a court orders a man out, puts him in this position. The man comes back, looks for overnight access, and the court is sorry, you can't have it because you don't have suitable accommodation. And it's the same court that put him in that position in the first place. So what happens and then is he becomes what's known as a McDonald's dad. In other words, his interaction with his children takes place in a totally artificial environment, somewhere like a McDonald's, which apart from everything else can inflict greater crime. Cost, if you meet them in shopping centres, children being children want this, want that, and it just makes it an artificial relationship, and so it becomes a relationship that's unsustainable in the long term as children get older. So really, I think the fact is, what has to be said and what married men should know is that married men are effectively, in theory, husband and wife are joint owners of the home. They own it under either what's known as a joint tenancy, which I think is legally known as a joint tenancy, or else a tenancy in common. But I think it's usually a joint tenancy. But in reality, that's in theory. Practice, the man only lives in the house. A married man only lives in this house at his wife's pleasure. In other words, she has the power to evict him at any time without him having committed any wrong whatsoever. So that's why I say Section 10 is a pivotal piece of legislation, family law legislation, that really destroys men's lives.
So we've spoken mainly about married men here. However, family law system also affects unmarried men.
It does.
How does it affect them?
It does. To some extent, in the same ways as regards parents, they are regarded, because they're men, fathers, they are the inferior parent, and really they're continued. If a relationship breaks down, an unmarried relationship, it's much the same. Their continued relationship with their children is always greatly diminished, and very often it's dependent on them paying maintenance. In other words, if you want to see your children, you pay the ransom. The 1964 Act, which I mentioned earlier, the Guardianship of Infants Act, in the definitions under that Act, they define a mother for the purposes of the Act. Effectively, it's a birth mother, the woman who gives, the biological mother who gives birth to the child, regardless of whether she's married or unmarried. She is legally still the mother. The definition of father in that Act is confined to fathers who are married to the children. The Act states specifically that that the definition of father does not include a man who is not married to the child's mother. And that was the position from 1964 onwards. Now, that has improved somewhat. There was an Act introduced in 1987 which followed on from a European court judgment. A man, I think his name was Keegan, took a case to the European court saying that the practices, that the manner in which he was dealt with infringed his human rights as a father, and the courts, because he wasn't allowed to become a guardian to his children. So the European courts issued a judgment that forced the government here to make provision allowing unmarried fathers to become guardians. So that Act allows unmarried men to become guardians if the mother agrees, and if she doesn't agree, he can go and apply to the court for an order to be made, but the mother can still oppose him in court. So effectively, a mother is still the gatekeeper. A mother still can determine or decide whether he becomes a guardian, and guardianship is very important for a father. It's effectively all the rights in relation to a father and his children. There's a slight problem with the declarations that the mother and the father sign, in that once they sign the declaration, the only record of him being a guardian is contained in that piece of paper, and if it's subsequently lost, there is no record. This is something that when I was involved in another organisation we tried to rectify many years ago. We tried to get a register of unmarried fathers who had been appointed guardian, an official register, and there was a piece of legislation going through the Dáil, through the Oireachtas at the time, called the Civil Registrations Act, and we got one sympathetic senator in that year, I think it was 2003, we got one sympathetic senator to try to insert an amendment in that act, making it, creating a register of, similar to say the register of births, marriages and deaths, a register that would show that particular fathers were made guardians. Unfortunately it didn't happen, which I suppose shows how little regard the powers that be have for fatherhood.
And that's kind of something that kind of this group has struggled with quite often whenever we kind of go to get support from politicians on any topic. You might get one and that's it.
Yeah, you get one, but you'll find that, to be honest, politicians in this day and age are very, very afraid of upsetting women's groups.
Yeah.
It reminds me back of, well, say the 1950s, it's always said that the Catholic Church controlled politicians, that the one thing they didn't want to do was step on Archbishop McQuaid's toes. And nowadays, Archbishop McQuaid's call on the Catholic Church is no longer the force it used to be.
Yeah.
Nowadays, the politicians are equally afraid of stepping on the toes of the feminist movement. So overall, in relation to unmarried fathers, I'd say they're in at least as bad, or probably a worse position as regards the security of their fatherhood, but they are in a better position as regards their right to live in their own home. They can't be kicked out of their homes as easily, but they can still be evicted. Cohabiting men, and very few know this, cohabiting men in cohabiting relationships, they're cohabitees, even though the cohabitees have made no input to the family home whatsoever. They gain certain rights by living there for a considerable period of time. So they can actually get some of the powers, I won't call them rights, they're powers that are available to married women by cohabiting for a long time. And this is done, I would call it almost like inflicting marriage by stealth on cohabiting couples, because this is done without their knowledge or consent. That's all contained in the 2010 Act dealing with cohabiting couples.
And if they get those additional powers, are they in a better position or a worse position?
Well, the man who is probably, for instance, if you own a house, and you meet a woman and she moves in with you to live, and particularly if you have children together, your ownership of that house isn't as secure as it once was, because, as I said, the state is, under that act, is inflicting marriage by stealth on that woman. He's given her powers. The state has given her powers, some of the powers that are available to married women. And that includes a share in the ownership of the house, even though you never got married, and even though she never contributed to it. It also will give her maintenance rights as well over time. So, I don't know what your position is, but you're learning, I hope.
Yeah, it's definitely not something that I have much experience with. I'm still a young man, so I haven't gone through the family law system. So
there's a lot young men have to learn, but unfortunately they don't.
Seeing the progression of other men going through the system, what is life like for men after they've gone through the system?
Well, life for men after going through family law, it depends to a large extent on their individual circumstances. If the man is well off, a high earner, then he can insulate himself to some extent against the worst effects of family law. If they're lower or middle income group, then they're a lot worse off.
Yeah.
Even relatively well paid men who may appear to be on good salaries, good wages, they often end up living in substandard accommodation with the resultant detrimental effect on their lives, on their relationships with their children, on their living standards. Now, some have, men sometimes are used to happen a lot and still happens. They're given a kind of a false hope when they're put in this position. And the false hope is caused by the orders made by the court at the time of separation. The courts, when they're making an order evicting a man, they rarely say, right, she's got the house for life. What they say is that she has got exclusive residency to the exclusion of the man until the children finish their education, until they're 23 years of age. So the man is evicted from his home, living in substandard accommodation, but he's got this hope that at some stage in the future things will improve for himself, that he'll get some value out of the house that he's bought and paid for over the years. But now and that would have been the feeling of a lot of men, say, that went into this back in the 90s and the early days. But now we've gone through, say, all of that. A lot of them have come out the other end. And they find that after, what happens then is after, say, maybe 20 years, when the children are reared, the children are no longer dependent, you go back to court and say, right, my children are no longer dependent. I want a new ruling on the exclusive residency. By that time you'll probably find that he's living in whatever kind of accommodation for maybe the best part of 20 years that he's secured for himself. She's living at home. She's probably in her 50s, maybe even 60s. Probably doesn't have a huge amount of income. The home, unless it's a very substantial residence, if you sell it, there's not enough in it to provide separate accommodation for both. So the judge will say, well, I can't throw her out. There's nothing I can do for you. So effectively, he's left where he was. So it's a false hope that's given to men. And it's maybe if that's what keeps some of them alive, but it's we're now finding that it just doesn't happen. I have known of a few men that have got small sums of money where the wife might have been earning and their wife was told, right, buy out his interest, become the owner, but you must pay him €20,000. But if you're looking for accommodation, 20, 30, 40,000 euros, nothing, do nothing for you.
So I think it's important to kind of talk about how the family law system adversely affects children, because we've been speaking a lot about how it affects men, but it affects children quite significantly as well. So how do they get affected in family separation cases?
Well, I mean, I don't think you could possibly argue that the family law system is good for children. A legal system that pits parents against each other and puts them into what an American judge once described as like putting them into a dog fight, like putting two dogs into a pit and having them fighting against each other. That can't be good for children. And even seeing their fathers evicted from their homes and in many ways humiliated and shoved to the periphery of their lives, that's not good for children either. Yet that's what's happened. Effectively, I remember there was a family mediator, I thought she spoke very wisely at a conference once, and she said the best way to take care of children in these situations is to take care of the parents. Put them into a dogfight is not taking care of the parents. And essentially said if you could get both parents, but she emphasised both parents, if you can secure a reasonable life for both parents then and their relationship with their children, you're doing the best you can for the children. Now, there's been a lot of talk in recent years about hearing the voice of children in these cases. That, I would say, is a double-edged sword. It's got its pros and cons. Now, superficially, it's very attractive. But there was a Brazilian psychologist once said that the most important right of any child is the right to a childhood. In other words, the right to be a child when you are a child. And when you're a child, you should not be expected to make adult decisions. So putting a child in a pivotal position to decide adult disputes can be very dangerous for a number of reasons. For a start, the child at that very early stage can make a decision or be enticed to make a decision that they'll regret later in life. There's also, of course, the very real danger of manipulation. If a child is in a position to decide or to influence the outcome of such serious issues, there's little doubt that the parent who has most control of the child, which is usually the woman,
usually the mother,
will manipulate them to ensure that she gets the best deal. This can often result in what's known as PA, parental alienation. At this point I should say that I'm aware that some women suffer from parental alienation as well as men. But there's a lack of understanding of parental alienation in this country. In fact, there's a lack of acceptance that it happens. And yet when you think about children having such a pivotal role in these decisions that include homes, money, and all the rest of it, it's inevitable that there's going to be manipulation and parental alienation. There is a group in this country called Alienated Children First who are doing a lot of work in this area of alienation. It consists of both men and women. I've had some contact with them and they've had some success. They have actually got most of the local authorities, county councils in the country to pass a motion to deal with to regard parental alienation as a crime.
I think it's all but one county council has recognised parental alienation
as a crime.
I actually can't recall which one hasn't,
but they've done some good work and they've had some success. And probably part of the reason they've had some success, whereas we don't, is that they have women in their organisation and it's an issue that affects women as well. If it was an issue that affected men only, I don't think they'd have as much success.
Also, I think it's kind of important to kind of raise when it comes to parental alienation is that some of the main opponents to it are women's groups, even though it happens to women.
Well, interestingly enough,
that should be an area where kind of men's groups and women's groups can actually work together.
Well, I've been kind of following the debates on this in the UK. Because what happens in the UK, things in this area usually happen first in America, then the UK, and then Ireland, you know. But anyway, the debate in the UK was very interesting if you followed it. Initially, it was Women's Aid UK was the group. They were totally against any recognition of the fact that parental alienation exists. And they said there's no such thing, it doesn't exist. Later on, and I think the position now is, yes, parental alienation exists, but only women are the victims. Men are not the victims. And parental alienation is used by abusive men. So their very black and white gender attitude really influences their views on everything. They're so black and white. Women good, men bad. But on that particular issue of parental alienation, earlier this week I saw that the Department of Justice published a programme of work, I think it is, for 2022. It's a very detailed document. But one of the things they have included in that programme of work is to look at the issue of parental alienation. So that may yield some results, but departments are very good at looking at things. Doing things is another question. Another issue, of course, for children is damage done by effectively driving fathers out of their lives. There are many studies that show the detrimental effects of father absence on children, and especially on boys. Some people don't like these studies to be highlighted because they see it as an attack on lone mothers. It isn't. It's just a recognition of a fact. And another issue here as well, I think I should point out at this point, is that in relation to access, when a court makes an order giving a man access to his children, women can breach it with impunity. When anybody breaks a court order, the ultimate sanction is imprisonment. It is in fact probably the only real sanction. But when a court makes an access order and a woman breaches it, you must remember the woman is now achieved the status of lone parent. And a judge will never imprison a woman, a lone parent, as children, regardless of how often she breaks court's orders. So effectively, achieving the status of lone parent puts them above the law, so they can break access orders with impunity.
Like also going kind of back to the negative effects of of fathers not being in the home with their children and how that negatively affects children is that a great example is when Barack Obama was running in 2008. He was asked, what is the biggest issue affecting Black America at the time? And he said, without a doubt, fatherless homes.
Is that right? Yeah, yeah.
And that,
He
and
recognised it.
like these days, you wouldn't even think that someone like Barack Obama would have said that, but he's dead right.
Mm.
And you can actually see the damage it's actually done to the black community in the States, because
crime rate.
and because Candace Owens highlights this quite often, is that when kind of the welfare kind of system was brought in, the single motherhood rate was 21% in the black community. It's now 74%. And when you see kind of like the degradation in kind of black community in the US, it strongly correlates with that. So it's definitely something that should be looked into a lot more, I think.
Well, it should definitely, absolutely. But you'd have to you'd have to get people to look into it objectively.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, like most social issues, particularly issues where there's a gender aspect, you'll never get anybody to look objectively. They're too afraid of stepping on the toes of the wrong people.
So we've heard a lot about how kind of the family law system can do a lot of damage to men. So how do men protect themselves from it?
How do men
from that damage?
Now that's a good question, a difficult question to answer. I really wish I knew the answer, but I don't. How do men protect themselves? Well, the facetious answer to that would be, don't get married and avoid relationships with women. And that's
kind of like what a lot of the MGTOW movement have gone, the men going their own way.
Actually,
I know I don't agree with kind of a lot of them. Some of them are definitely woman haters, fair enough. But you can definitely understand where a lot of them are coming from when it comes to the risks of kind of getting married.
I'm not advocating
MGTOW stuff, yeah, fair enough.
But I'm saying I can fully understand why people
you can see where they're coming from, but kind of the way they go about things is
and
definitely the wrong way.
A lot of people are, and always have, and are choosing. They're not aware it's called MGTOW.
Yeah.
But that's the lifestyle they're choosing. I mean, I've met men, quite a few men, who were seriously contemplating marriage and they pulled out.
Yeah. I
remember one man who was at me not so long ago, wondering if he got married in Rome, would he still be covered by the Irish law? And I had to tell him, unfortunately, it doesn't matter where you get married, once it's legal marriage, you're then covered by Irish law. And I'm not sure if the law in Rome is any better, but no, I can understand MGTOW, and MGTOW's always been there, and to be honest, if you want a safe, hassle-free life, there's a lot to be said for it. I suppose the most realistic advice to men would be, well, if you are going to head down the road of marriage or getting into a serious intimate relationship, is first of all choose carefully, very carefully. Watch out for the warning signs. I mean, they would be things like controlling behaviour, someone who tends to be very moody, bad-tempered, someone who's very needy, who leans on you too much, expects you to solve all our problems. Somebody who shows you a lack of mutual respect. Somebody who blames you for all our problems. And the one, to me, the most lethal of all is the woman who is perpetually acting a victim. Because the woman who acts the victim is the most powerful of all.
Yeah.
Because you cannot really challenge the woman who says, I'm a victim. I suppose a more pertinent question than how do men protect themselves would be, what can we do to protect men? And well, I suppose the best thing we can do is give them the information, which is what we're doing now.
Yeah.
Give them information about all these issues that I've spoken about. And unfortunately, they know nothing about them now. Men, there's I think about 20,000 marriages a year, which is 40,000 people.
Yeah.
So you're talking about 20,000 men going into marriage and they know absolutely nothing about what marriage involves. It's a civil, some go into two marriages, a church marriage and a civil marriage. But to go into civil marriage, is marriage covered by civil law, and they know absolutely nothing, and they're told nothing about well, they're told very little about the civil law aspects of it and how civil law affects their lives. A lot of men or a lot of people going into marriage do go through what are called marriage guidance courses. The body that provides most of the marriage guidance courses in this country is a group called Accord. Now, Accord would have initially been set up by the Catholic Church, and they probably still have a Catholic ethos. So when it comes to giving them guidance on marriage, they might give them a lot of good advice and information, but they don't. They prefer not to contemplate the possibility of marriage breakdown. So they don't go into what happens after marriage breakdown, even though figures from abroad would suggest that 2 in every 5 marriages will break down. In other words, only 60% survive until death do us part.
And like, there was, over in the States, it's actually a lot worse. I think it's 75% of marriages
Is it?
break down or something like that.
I don't know, but I
But
know.
like, kind of the comedian Bill Burr kind of brought it up on one of his sketches, and he kind of went, why do people still get married? Like, is anyone looking at the figures? 3 out of 4 marriages go right down the toilet. So
Yeah, well, I mean, what the men should be told is what the consequences of marriage breakdown are, what men's lives are like, what the average man's life is like after divorce or separation. And in particular, they should be told that when you sign that marriage register, you're signing a document that effectively turns you into a lodger in your wife's home, because that white woman has the power to evict you from home by simply going through a few simple procedures. In fact, it's a lot easier for a wife to evict her husband from a home than it is for a landlord to evict a tenant. And if a landlord evicts a tenant, at least the tenant doesn't have to pay rent anymore. Whereas a man evicted from his home continues to have to pay the mortgage or the rent or whatever. So really, I think they should be told about what men's lives like are after separation. I suppose the other side of that is, if, as you say, if more men knew what happens to them after separation, like a lot less men getting married. And to be fair to women, I'd say that women don't know either what the civil law, what the laws governing marriage, and particularly the laws governing separation are. They might have had an inkling or might have some understanding, but to be honest, I don't think most women would want to have that power over another citizen. And unfortunately, whether they want it or not, it's inflicted on them by the state.
Like,
so
there was an interesting clip from this morning. That was a very old clip of a guy called Peter Lloyd. He went over to he's in the UK, and he's kind of spoke about, like, is marriage a bad deal for men? And he kept talking about kind of the risks and how it's a raw deal. And he kind of goes really into the risks of kind of marriage, especially if it breaks down. And then he goes like, so doesn't it make sense that it's a bad deal when you look at all these serious risks? And it was Philip Schofield who was on at the time. His only response was, "Have you been hurt?" So it was like, and Peter goes, actually, no, I'm in a good place right now, but like, I'm just saying it from a factual point of view, it's a raw deal. But yet so many people think that when men talk about the risks, they're talking about it from an emotional place, not a factual place.
That's right.
Even though there's so many facts to show.
Yeah, that's a response you'll get where they have no argument against the whatever you're saying, the argument you're presenting or the facts you're presenting. They turn on you. In other words, they can't attack the message, so let's attack the message. That's a tactic, and it's very common when you raise men's issues. And when you present facts that are irrefutable, that show that men are not privileged. Despite all this talk of male privilege, men are far from privileged in our society. But as I say, if men knew, maybe less men would be getting married. No, I'm not saying let's abolish marriage, but let's actually make it a bit. Let's level the playing field, make it a bit more even for men and women, and let's not have this extreme power that's in the hands of women. And let's not create, I mean, when divorce is going through, we heard a lot of talk about compassion and be compassionate to the people.
Yeah.
And we heard about no fault divorce. Well, if it's no fault divorce, no fault separation, why
is the man being treated as if he's completely
penalised? Absolutely. Why is he being penalised so horrifically? But it's difficult to get all this through to the powers that be.
I think the main kind of issue with the family law system is it's an adversarial system. So it would naturally create quite a bit of hostility between parents, which is, I think, in these kind of situations is the last thing you want. So can you give an example of how the structures and procedures in the system creates and exacerbates that kind of hostility between parents?
Well, yeah, the hostility is a big part of it, but also the fact that the hostility is so damaging to men. In fact, you could almost say that if women want a real victory, the more hostility they create, the better.
Yeah.
The more hostility, the more severe the loss for the man. But the marriage relationship breakdown by its very nature is going to contain or create some level of hostility between the parties. Now, in my view, the state, of course, got involved in this back in 1989, shoving the state into these breakdowns, legislating for them. My view, the role of the state should be to create legislation and structures that are designed to reduce hostility.
Yeah.
And to encourage parents to take responsibility for reorganising their own lives and their children's lives in a way that will be fair to all parties in the future and allow all parties to get on with their lives. Instead, the state has done the exact opposite. It's created what they would call a solution, which is totally hostility creating. As currently operates, the system pushes parents to take polarised positions and to use the court as a court of first resort rather than a court of last resort. That, of course, suits the legal profession, and of course it helps grow the industry. Just an example of that would be every separation starts off with what is known as a civil bill. A civil bill, the party who's initiating the proceedings serves a civil bill on the other party. And in over 80% of cases, women initiate separations and divorces, for the very obvious reason that they're looking at the outcome at the end of it all, and they're guaranteed victory to a greater or less extent.
When you say a civil bill, what is a civil bill?
I'll explain that to you now. Essentially, it's a bill that served the other party listing their demands, and these demands aren't moderate or reasonable. The demands are, gimme everything. Give me 100% of the home, give me 90% of the children, 90% of the earnings. It's couched in the most extreme terms, demanding everything and demanding that the other party be left with nothing. Also, another feature of these civil bills is that they try as far as possible to denigrate and demonise the other party. And that is, it mightn't happen in all of them, but it happens in the vast majority. Denigrate the other party as far as possible. And that would even include false accusations. In fact,
we've actually mentioned that in the introduction to this, where we brought up false accusations, and a lot of it is in the family law.
In the family law and in divorce separations, false accusations come up. In fact, earlier this week I read of a case down in County Wicklow where a man and woman got through the divorce, and the woman accused her husband of rape. So eventually he managed to clear himself of the accusation, and the judge took a dim view of the woman making this false accusation of rape against her husband in order to gain an advantage in the separation. But of course, she didn't suffer any severe penalties. She hasn't been imprisoned. Yeah. The only penalty she suffered was apparently that in awarding costs, the judge awarded the man 60% of his costs, I think it was. Normally, both parties pay their own costs.
Yeah.
So he imposed a slight financial penalty on her for making a false rape allegation against him purely to gain advantage in a separation case.
And but that's not common, is it? That they actually get punished at all, is it?
No.
No.
No. I mean, even in the criminal law, there's no, it's another day's work, but even criminal law.
Yeah, we are going to be doing a video on false accusations.
False accusation of rape isn't a crime. It's not a crime to make a false accusation of rape. It's not a crime against the person you're making the accusation.
It's not a crime against the person.
It's a crime against the.
It's a crime against
state.
It's a crime to make a false report to the Gardaí.
It's really the crime is wasting the police officer's time rather than the crime is committed, the damage done to the innocent party. So it's not criminal. Now that's something else we probably will be looking at. But anyway, they come back to digress a little bit. Going back to the civil bill. The civil bill, as I said, is gimme everything, give the other person nothing, because the other person's out and out, you know what. No considerations given to the future life or needs of the other party. And I suppose the responding party will probably respond in a similar vein. Now the thing is that courts accept this hostility provoking process as a matter of routine. This is normal to them. They see nothing wrong with it. In my view, the courts, when they get something as extreme as that, they should throw them out and say, go to hell, get out of here. Come back with reasonable proposals that allow all parties to get on with their lives.
But they're so used to those extreme proposals that they see it as normal.
They don't see anything wrong with it. The courts, the judges see nothing wrong with it. But to me, it is so extreme, it should be gotten rid of. Actually, we're not the only people that are advocating to get rid of that civil bill. Carol Coulter, Irish Times legal affairs correspondent, did research on family laws many years ago, and she commented on the civil bill, and she also suggested that it should be gotten rid of because it just creates hostility, exacerbates hostility. But then again, it hasn't happened, to my knowledge it hasn't happened. It's still as bad as ever. The other thing in relation to hostility is there is a mediation service there. The idea of the mediation service is it's an attempt to try and to get parties to work out their own arrangements, better arrangements, without going into the destructive, expensive legal system. But it only happens if both parties are prepared to go and both parties are prepared to compromise. And it does produce settlements that are vastly superior to the court-ordered settlements. But the big problem again with it is that mediation operates in the shadow of the court system. And because of the law, a man going into a mediation session, this is metaphorically speaking, he's going in with a gun to his head. And that gun is Section 10. The woman's power to throw him out of the home. So effectively the legal term for fair negotiations is both parties have an equality of arms. They do not have equality of arms going into family mediation. The man effectively has a gun to his head. And part of the mediation service claim a high settlement rate, and on paper it looks like a high settlement rate, but part of the reason for the high settlement rate is the fact that men have the gun to their head, and they think
they just agree to whatever
they have to agree, because if they don't agree, the wife can say, well, we'll go to court and I'll get everything I want, or 90% of what I want there. So men try to reach some kind of an agreement at mediation in order to cut their losses. Many years ago I was at a seminar organised by the the Family Mediation Service, and there was a video at the beginning of it. It was kind of actors playing the role of parties at a mediation service, but finished up with, I remember asking him how did it finish up, and he said, well, at the end of the day, it was based on a real case. Well, he said, at the end of the day, the woman said, look, I'll get home in court, so you may as well go out now, and he agreed, because he knew that he was going to lose in court anyway. So effectively mediation's a good idea, but we actually think it should be mandatory before going into court. Try to make the court of last resort, but it hasn't happened. And
men kind of go into that almost handcuffed.
Almost handcuffed, or as I say, with a metaphoric gun to their head.
Yeah. So to kind of finish up, what does Men's Voices Ireland propose what changes would they propose to make the system fairer and more humane, really?
Um, well, I talked a bit there about the civil bill and the damage it does. So certainly we would want to get rid of the civil bill.
Yeah.
But then the question is what to replace it with. Then I would say that we should replace it with a document that is designed to reduce hostility, not create or exacerbate hostility. For instance, it should be replaced. Parties should be obliged, applicants should be obliged to put forward proposals for the reorganisation of the family unit, and to reorganise it in ways that would be fair to all parties and allow all parties to get on with their lives in reasonable comfort. It should be actually be required to make proposals which take account not only of their own needs, but of the ongoing needs of all parties, and most especially they should be asked to take account of the future joint parenting of the children and of the accommodation needs of all. There's in Japan, in industrial relations, they've got a system called pendulum arbitration, which is the dynamics that it creates is opposite to the dynamic that's created here. In other words, what parties to a dispute do is both sides put in their proposals, and the arbitrator in the middle looks at both and decides this one's the fairest, so we'll go with this one. So the dynamic there is to make the parties go for more modest, more moderate proposals, whereas the dynamic in the Irish family law system pushes them to extremes, extreme polarisation. We'd also look at, there's a thing in the United States called the Families in Transition Program. What this is effectively is a kind of, we have pre-marriage courses. This would be similar to a pre-marriage course. It would be called a pre-separation course. Because right now, parties go into separation with lots of hostility and anger, and they're not prepared for it, and they go straight into the dogfight in the court. And that only just makes the whole thing worse. Whereas if you had a program like the Families in Transition Program, which is in certain states in the US, it would prepare the families better for going through the process and for life after, and it would undoubtedly reduce the hostility and the anger and the greed. So that's something else we'll be looking at. Another thing we want to do is get rid of this concept of custody and access. This is a very divisive term, custody and access. Sole custody to the mother, access to the father. Sole custody implies ownership of the children. In other words, what they're saying is the mother owns the children, the father's just another uncle kind of, and they're reduced to that status. It says that one parent is superior and the other is inferior. I mean, you must remember that before a separation, married cases, a married couple are both equal joint custodians of their children. So the question is, why is this almost automatically, why is their status almost automatically diminished without reason when they go into court? It's done without any thought given to whether or not there's any justification for diminishing the father's status, legal status as a parent. And it's just done as a matter of course. It's like so many things. No thought, no regard. If they got rid of that whole custody and access business, just made arrangements for the future joint parenting of the children, it would go a long way to reducing hostility. In the UK, they've stopped using the terms custody and access, but they've started instead using terms residency and contact. That doesn't really solve it. Doesn't really do it. It's just as bad. It also implies an inferior and a superior parent, so it doesn't really do anything. Mediation, of course, we actually think that mediation probably should be mandatory. We certainly don't think that people should be walking straight into court when feelings are raw and all that, and people aren't prepared. And they walk into court and have no idea what they're facing. They're dragged into court in front of these professionals, skilled professionals, who put them on a stand, give them the most intensive grilling, and they're not prepared for it. So court should not be a court of first resort. Now, I suppose the Department of Justice, that program, the Department of Justice program which I saw in the last few days, it does mention it does indicate that they have a desire to try and make the system less adversarial.
Yeah.
Personally, if you're asking me, do I have any optimism? My answer is no.
Yeah.
No, because first and foremost, the vested interest, what I would call that toxic coalition between feminists and the legal profession, it's not in their interests to make it less adversarial. And they're the people who dictate to the Department of Justice. It's highly unlikely that they'll take any real steps. They'll make token gestures, like maybe throwing more money at mediation or something like that, but in dealing with the real structure, in dealing with
it's not dealing with the core problems of the system.
No, they won't deal with the core problems. They won't deal with the extremely one-sided outcomes. They won't deal with that. And one of the things they won't allow, which has never happened and which has led to this, is that they won't deal with the absence of men's issues being articulated. They won't listen to men's
they wouldn't
issues.
listen.
But up to this, there have been many forums and whatnots and committees on various issues affecting the relations between men and women and affecting family law. In all of these cases, women's groups will be represented, but there'll be absolutely nobody representing men. And the odd time they do make a token gesture at getting a man's group involved, or what appears to be a man's group, they go for men's groups who are seen to be ideologically pure from a feminist perspective. In other words, groups that will not push the issues that we're pushing, groups that will be afraid to say anything that might offend the National
I think it kind of goes against the idea of are they able to defend their viewpoints, because it's almost a fear of having those viewpoints challenged because they can't actually defend them.
Well, yeah. I mean, if the Department of Justice is serious about creating a less adversarial family law system, then they have to listen to us. We have good proposals that will do that and will make it fairer, but they don't want to. Because
there's not much justice in the Department of Justice.
There's not much justice, and there's not much backbone either when it comes to dealing with certain groups. They're afraid to say no to certain groups. They're not afraid to say no to us. In fact, they're not afraid to exclude us.
So that's pretty much it for this episode. So if you want to find out more about Men's Voices Ireland and the topic of family law, you can visit our website, www.mensvoicesireland.com. You can contact us by email at mensvoicesireland@gmail.com. Now, Men's Voices Ireland do rely on donations from the public. So if you want to donate to support the work that we do, you can go to the Men's Voices Ireland website and go to our donate page. So it's mensvoicesireland.com/donate. And also you can kind of follow us on our various social media platforms. So it's at Men's Voices on Facebook, it's Men's Voices Ireland on Instagram, and it's Men's Voices Ireland _IRL on Twitter. So thanks for listening to this episode of the Men's Voices Ireland podcast. If you like this episode, like and share it so the information contained in it can go out to as many people as possible. And if you want to join in the conversation, leave a comment down below, and we're interested to hear what you have to say. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.